Hey everyone, Delv here. You can check out my channels here. Today I'm going to go over both Hexes and the Chaos and Dark Infusions in Dark Souls 3. The reason why I'm covering both of these at once is because they're really complementary to each other and they aren't really worth covering in their own in individual videos because there's really not that much to say about either of them. To explain what these even are, we'll start with the Hexes. Hexes are dark element miracles or sorceries that can scale with both intelligence and faith when used with certain catalysts. When you have a character built around them, they are surprisingly effective spells, offering a wide range of powerful and useful attributes, and I must say that I found them shockingly effective. The main downside is that, of course, they only come in that dark element, so you'll almost certainly need to augment them with some source of fire damage, such as a Chaos Infusion. Additionally, Hexes themselves aren't technically their own group of spells. All of them fall into the category of either miracle or sorcery, so even though you have to have a decent amount of both faith and intelligence to make use of them, you still end up being locked into one or the other at any given moment because of rings like the Bellowing Dragon Crest ring, which can only buff the damage of sorceries, for example. But on the main, I actually think that for a character built around them, Hexes are some of the best spells in the game. The scaling for Hexes stops at 45 intelligence and 45 faith, which is not bad at all given the solid spellcasting. Next, I'll briefly talk about Chaos and Dark Infusions. There's actually not that much to say about them in general. The basic idea is that it reduces the strength and dexterity scaling of a weapon, but it does give the weapon decent faith and intelligence scaling as well, in either the fire or dark element. As far as I know, these infusions result in the exact same numbers for most, if not all, weapons. The only difference between the two is the element. Fire and Dark are extremely complementary damage types, and the actual scaling works out to be pretty decent damage overall. The main downside is the split damage between physical and elemental. That interacts with enemy defenses in a way that tends to give you less damage than if it were pure physical or elemental damage. These infusions are also only obtainable after the first quarter of the game, so be aware you'll have to fight through at least 5 bosses to be able to obtain either one of them. The elemental scaling stops at 30 intelligence and 30 faith, but the infusion only reduces the physical scaling and does not remove it. So the actual closest comparison to these infusions in another Souls game is the Mundane Infusion. A character built exclusively around the Chaos or Dark Infusions in Dark Souls 3 would actually have well-rounded stats and somewhat resemble a mundane character from Dark Souls 2. I'm not sure if it's a good infusion type for New Game Plus, I kind of doubt it, but it's also a low effort way to get decent elemental damage if you need that for any reason. Like I said, I think Hexes and Chaos Infusions are extremely complementary, and I do highly recommend pairing them together, creating a surprisingly effective character. Okay, so onto the game progression. You could probably do any class you wanted here, as few stats are really going to waste for a character built around these things, but I went with Herald since you start with a talisman and have decent attunement to start. Now the main question you might have is what weapons do best with the Chaos and Dark Infusions. Just like Fire and Deep, any weapon type that has an otherwise bad damage type, so straight swords and axes, are great examples. Additionally, because these infusions don't remove physical scaling and have better elemental damage than non-scaling infusions, these infusions are also fairly decent on many other types of weapons as well. Weapons like daggers, halberds, and the Astora Greatsword are all incredibly good options. Not the Astora Straight Sword, mind you, the Astora Greatsword. The most basic example is the broadsword, and I also used the Lucerne throughout the entire first half of the game as well, and it was pretty good, although it does fall off against the DLC bosses because of the split damage. Now, like I said earlier, to even infuse a weapon with Chaos or Dark, you will need either the Giant's Coal from Anor Londo or the Profane Coal from the Irithyll dungeon. In the meantime, we'll focus instead on Hexes, and they are pretty good in the first half of the game. The first thing to mention is Yol and Yuria of Londor. These NPCs have a distinct questline, so make sure you understand how that works. Yuria can sell Londor Divine Braille Tome, which can of course be given to Irina of Karim. Giving her this tome and then buying a Dark Miracle will get you the bad end to her questline, so be aware that this could lock you out of the Light Miracles if you buy all the Dark Miracles from her, so keep that in mind. The main miracle of note here is Dark Blade, which is one of the earliest buff spells you can obtain in the game, and is quite good. Do note, however, that this is not in fact a hex, technically, in the sense that even when used with the proper catalyst, this miracle will never scale with intelligence, so it is actually a much stronger spell for a character that is fully invested in faith with a pure faith scaling catalyst. Kind of weird for a dark spell, but that's just how it is. Speaking of catalysts, the first hex catalyst you can find is the Sunless Talisman, which can be obtained by either killing Cirrus of the Sunless Realms or by completing her questline. Killing her is actually pretty easy to do, and she can first appear in Firelink Shrine after talking to Henri and Horus in the Road of Sacrifices. The Sunless Talisman has some unique features. It has a high faith requirement of 28, so be prepared for that. Like I've already said, it scales up to 45 faith and 45 intelligence exclusively on some dark miracles, and supposedly it gains a bit of bonus damage on melee range dark miracles. All the main Hex catalysts are upgraded with Twinkling Titanite, which is annoying in the first half of the game, but is actually kind of nice in the second half of the game, where Twinkling Titanite becomes quite common. Now we have to head back to Luria really fast. I need to mention the Dark Hand, which is a highly interesting weapon, not unlike a Dark Infused weapon. In the left hand, it functions as a highly magic resistant shield, and also has a grab attack that can be used against other players and NPC invaders. When used in the right hand, however, it becomes a decent fist weapon with decent across the board scaling in both the physical and the dark element, not unlike a dark or chaos infused weapon. It's fairly expensive to buy, but it also doesn't need to be upgraded, and is a solid option for most of the game. There are somewhat similar fire element boss weapons as well, with the same kind of thing going on in that they have decent across the board scaling, but most of those have stat requirements that make them awkward for a hex-based character early on, such as having a strength requirement of 20 or above, but also not bad options either. Now the first actual hex is Gnaw, and it is a miracle. It can be obtained from the Deep Braille Divine Tome. The main power of this spell is the solid bleed damage that it does, making it very easy to get bleed procs against a wide variety of enemies, including some bosses. With the right stat distribution and a Hex Catalyst, it also even does pretty good dark damage as well on top of all of that. As far as I know, there's no real use for this spell after you obtain the stronger version of it, but it's actually a pretty amazing spell in the first half of the game, useful against a wide range of enemies. The next Hex is Deep Soul, which can be obtained by trading in the Deacons of the Deep Soul with Ludleth of Courland. When you have the right stat distribution, and when your character is built around it, it may actually be the single most mana efficient spell in the entire game, dealing decent damage for its extremely low mana cost. Because of this, it's even a decent candidate against DLC bosses, and I used it against the first and second phases of the Sister Frida fight. Now on to the Dark Sorcery Catalyst. That is the Isless Staff, which can be located behind 2 illusory walls in the Smoldering Lake, near the Giant Rat. Not much to say about this, scales up to 45 intelligence and 45 faith with dark sorceries like other dark catalysts, and upgrades with Twinkling Titanite. You may wonder whether I recommend spending your Twinkling Titanite on this or on the Sunless Talisman. Honestly, it comes down to personal preference. Gnaw is insanely good against Silver Knights and Pontiff Soulvein, and I use that to great effect against them. Deep Soul is also generally good against most enemies, and I used it against the old Demon King. I upgraded both the Sunless Talisman and the Isless Staff up equally, and they still both managed to serve me very well and be useful, so it's really a matter of personal preference between the two. Next up is Doris' Gnawing, which is the upgraded version of Gnaw, and it can be found behind an illusory wall in Irithyll of the Boreal Valley. I sort of glossed over this in the Faith Guide, but it's a solid spell, dealing both decent dark damage and considerable bleed damage. It's a decent contender for one of the best spells in the game, honestly, at least against any enemy weak to bleed. I used it to extreme effect against the Demon Prince alongside the Dusk Crown Ring, and in this particular case it was extremely potent because I could still summon NPCs, and then even though the boss's health increases the more NPCs I summon, in spite of that, the bleed damage still does percentage-based damage, so really effective against the Demon Princes, and I highly recommend it. Now next up is Life Hunt Scythe. This is a hex that can be obtained by trading in Aldrich's Soul with Ludleth of Courland. When used on a character with the right setup, it's alright. The healing is super cool, but it's a melee range spell with a slow casting speed, so it's never actually going to be that useful in my opinion. Same with Dark Edge and Affinity, which are sorceries, dark sorceries, and they can be bought from Carla after you rescue her from the Irithyll dungeon. These spells are cool in theory, but not useful even on a character built around hexes. Now the last available casting tool that's relevant is Kaith's Chime, which can be obtained in Lothric Castle. Also upgraded with Twinkling Titanite, this chime has slightly better performance than the Sunless Talisman, and probably you'll want to switch to this one for the DLC bosses because melee range hexes aren't really very good. And the final relevant hex is Great Soul Dregs, which can be found in the Dreg Heap. Now this is a sorcery, and on a character built around it, it's one of the best spells in the entire game, dealing exceptional damage, and I used it in tandem with Deep Soul against Frida, Nameless King, Soul of Cinder, and Half-Light, and it proves to be extremely effective. I highly, highly recommend this spell as being probably the best hex in the game. So I've gone over how to beat Frida, Demon Princess, and Half-Light. All that's left is to talk about Meteor and Gale. For these, you will almost certainly need to use a Chaos-infused weapon, and there's not really much to say about them. They're pretty standard and obvious in terms of how they work. As far as these DLC bosses are concerned, I'd say their performance is weaker than the main physical infusions, but better than all the other elemental infusions. And the key thing to note about them is what kind of stat distribution you want. So, if your plan is to maximize hex damage, 45 intelligence and 45 faith is basically required, and I actually do kind of recommend that. I think it's actually pretty good. But if your goal is to really focus on the Chaos and Dark infusions, the ideal stat distribution would probably be 30 intelligence and 30 faith, and then to hit most of the good defensive soft caps, things like 20 health, maybe 20 stamina, maybe 16 or 20 in attunement, and then you could probably put a pretty decent number of points into a physical stat. Maybe the main soft cap for stats like strength and dexterity is 40. I don't know if it's really worth it to go all the way there, but that's something you totally could do. And with that, you do pretty good damage with a Chaos and Dark infused weapon and be decently durable as well. And that's not a bad way to do things. It's very important to note, though, that Great Soul Dregs has an intelligence requirement of 40. So no matter what, you may want to hit that 40 intelligence, even if you're only getting to 30 faith, and because I think it's one of the best spells in the game. But you could also probably get away with using just Deep Soul and do just fine. It's a great ranged option, and if you're focusing on Chaos, that'll do you just fine. You really don't need anything more than Deep Soul. Now for rings, the standard issue options apply here. Ring of Steel Protection, Estus Ring, and Gold and Silver Covetous Serpent Rings are the main ones I personally love and recommend. And then of course Chloranthy Ring and Ring of Favor are decent options as well. For spellcasting, Morin's Ring and Ring of the Sun's Firstborn for the dark miracles like Doris's Gnawing, and Young Dragoncrest Ring and Bellowing Dragoncrest Ring for sorcery such as Deep Soul, and of course Dark Clutch Ring and Sage's Ring are good options as well either way for casting in general. Now, I also found Dusk Crown Ring to be a decent option here. Because Doris's Gnawing costs a decent amount of mana, this may be a decent option just so you get a couple extra casts of that so you can bleed the Demon Prince. And that's really all there is to say about both Hexes and Chaos and Dark Infusions. I'll say I think that both of these, especially together, are way better than any other kind of spellcasting in the game. Not as strong as Non-Scaling. I think Non-Scaling was probably the strongest character so far, but this character was also refreshingly decent in terms of how they actually managed to get through the game. Thanks for watching.